I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Deirdre Regan, who is a good clinical practice pharmacovigilance inspection manager with HPRA, and she's going to talk to us about the topic of what to expect from a regulatory inspection focusing on medicines.
Well, thank you very much for inviting a representative of the HPRA compliance group to speak to you today at your first meeting. We appreciate being involved and being asked to get involved, and hope that we can contribute something that would be of use to you. So today I'll go through a brief outline of the status of clinical trials in Ireland. I'll describe the inspection process, planning, notification, conduct and follow-up. I'll describe some deficiencies that we have noted and discuss those. A few little points to note about non-commercial trials, and then I'll finish with deficiencies we've noted in the few CRF inspections that we've done to date, which I hope we have helped you. Okay, the clinical trial status in Ireland, we have about 350 ongoing trials, about 90 are authorised per year. 50% of those are in oncology and haematology, and about 10% are non-commercial. It's important to note that the clinical trials legislation applies equally to commercial and non-commercial trials. There really is no such thing as GCP light. There are certain adaptations that can be made for non-commercial trials, but GCP applies because you need, no matter what kind of trial you're doing, to ensure that subject safety and data credibility and compliance with GCP. We've been conducting inspections in non-commercial trials since 1999, and in the others for slightly longer. So planning, I'll start with planning. We can inspect any site or contracted facility, subcontractor involved in the conduct of a clinical trial. The majority of our inspections are actually done at investigator sites, but we can go into clinical labs or data management facilities or any of the other facilities that are involved. When we're planning our inspections, it's basically risk-based planning. So we look at sites that have a high level of clinical trial activity. Obviously, the busier sites, we'd like to see how things are being conducted there. If an investigator, a site or a sponsor has not been inspected before, they'll be of interest to us. Novel therapeutic areas are always of interest. So once we've decided where we're inspecting, we notify the inspectees 4 to 6 weeks in advance, and we agree dates, and we include a request for quite an amount of documentation. We review as much of that in advance of the inspection as we possibly can to prepare, but some of it will be reviewed during the inspection as well. So we stay for approximately 3 days for a site inspection. A sponsor inspection can take longer, but for an ordinary site inspection it's about 3 days, and depends on the complexity of the trial and what we're inspecting. It'll be 1 to 3 inspectors. There are a total of 3 of us in the group. All inspections include interviews, document reviews and demonstrations. Now we start with an opening interviewer meeting, and we always ask that the principal investigator is present for that, and at the closing meeting we also ask that the principal investigator is present for that. Between those 2 meetings, often research nurses or other site staff liaise with the investigators, because we try to disrupt normal medical practice as little as possible during inspection, so we're flexible about that. Okay. During an inspection, if we find something we consider to be a potentially major or critical issue, we raise it with the inspectees on an ongoing basis, because we give you every chance to raise the case for the defence and to explain to us what's going on. Obviously, you know much more about what's going on at your sites and in your trial than we could ever possibly know in the few days that we're working on it. So we look to you for explanations where there's potential issues. Then we get to the closing meeting, and during that we define deficiencies. Critical, major and minor deficiencies are defined in the same way across Europe. So we are bound to read to you the definitions of those. We summarise inspection findings. We classify them as far as possible, but if we think something is critical, we cannot classify it at the closing meeting. We have to bring it back in-house to the HPRA, where there is a multidisciplinary meeting organised to discuss it. At that meeting, there will be the heads of compliance and the heads of the pharmacovigilance group or the human medicines group, depending on the nature of the deficiency. So we don't casually classify anything as critical. The most we will do is advise you that we think it may be classified that way. We realise that critical deficiencies have serious implications for all concerned, so we are careful about that. During that closing meeting, if you have any questions relating to any of the findings, we will hope to answer them. But throughout the inspection, during a good inspection, there's quite a bit of interaction. If you have any questions, you ask us. We have any questions, we ask you. It's better if it's done that way, so that there are no surprises at the closing meeting. We explain also the follow-up activities. So inspection follow-up, we have to produce a report on day 15, day 1 being the first day after the inspection. You have a further 20 days to respond, and then there may be correspondence to and fro where to agree a final corrective and preventive action plan, and we're supposed to close the inspection by day 90. Okay, these are the definitions used throughout Europe of critical, major and minor. So I just read critical to begin with. Conditions, practices or processes that adversely affect the rights, safety or well-being of the subjects and or the quality and integrity of data. Major are those that might affect those things and they're violations of GCP. Minor are issues that would not be expected to affect those. Now, so I'll go through some examples of deficiencies that we have noted, and while I'm going through these you'll see sometimes what looks like the same issue is classified as critical and major, and I'll explain why. During our inspections we continue to find the biggest problem and the biggest number of deficiencies relates to protocol non-compliance. And if you go away from here today with any one message, it's the importance of complying with the protocol. Compliance with the protocol is mandatory. That's the basis on which the trial was approved. That's the basis on which the benefit risk assessment was done. So it's really important to comply with it. We understand that sort of life gets in the way sometimes and there are deviations from protocols. But it's very, very important that those deviations are documented and managed. That we can see that you developed a corrective and preventive action plan, but did whatever corrections are possible, made sure that the deviation didn't recur. That it's important, particularly where critical deviations are noted. So for example, on one occasion we saw the assessment of subject eligibility was not documented by an investigator. Eligibility is a medical decision and it needs to be documented by an investigator. In this case in point we could see no evidence that the investigator had been involved in assessing eligibility. That's why it was classified as critical. We often see that test procedures are not done or not documented. Now this typically happens where a protocol requires a change from normal practice at a site. So for example, it might require an additional biochemistry panel or an additional scan of some sort. And the staff working at the site are used to doing it a particular way, and the fact that the protocol demands extra is not noted or not acted upon. That's a particular area of error really. So you need to, if you're starting a clinical trial, you need to assess it for changes from normal practice and make sure all staff involved in the trial are made aware of the changes from normal practice. So again, my key message is protocol compliance is mandatory. We found critical deficiencies in the areas of serious adverse event reporting and management, so not recorded in CRFs, not reported within the required timelines, immediate reporting is necessary. Sorry, I just turned that back. And not followed up within appropriate timelines. It's obviously very important that serious adverse events are managed with a view to patient safety and subject safety in a trial. Informed consent is another area where we have noted critical deficiencies not signed by the subject prior to enrolment. Again, a key message for you here is that the current version of the consent form that has been approved or been given a favourable opinion, I should say, by the Ethics Committee should be signed and dated by the subject and investigator prior to enrolment. Adequate version control of informed consent forms is essential. and we often see deficiencies in that area. It's important to be extremely careful about this because of you're violating patients' rights if there's anything wrong with this, and there would be a huge concern about indemnity and insurance cover in the event of anything going wrong if the informed consent records were not in order. So it's very important that that be done correctly. Obviously, subjects should never be randomised to treatment prior to the IMB approval, which should say HPRA, sorry. Our name changed last July.
Only a protocol deviation.
Okay. Now you'll notice that I'm going to cite some similar things as major deficiencies. We judge each case on its merits. So, for example, I say that non-compliance with all requirements of the protocol, example, a non-routine lab test was not done. That was classified as major because several other tests were done because it was not, did not relate to a primary efficacy endpoint, did not compromise the safety of the subject. Notwithstanding it was a protocol deviation, it shouldn't have happened, okay? So it depends on the circumstances of the case how the deviation is classified. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Deviations not documented, that's not good enough. We need to see deviations documented and followed to a conclusion. Some major deficiencies in informed consent. The current approved consent form not used, the latest second last version was used. Consent signed after study entry, that what I mean there is the consent to the current form is signed after study entry. Updates to consent forms not given to subjects in a timely manner. Again, that depends on what the update is. If it's a very important update, then we would expect them to be, subjects to be notified very quickly. If it's more an administrative update, you wouldn't expect to see that. It's not as important, and they can be updated at the next visit. Subjects didn't personally date signature. Surprisingly enough, we still see that. The investigator must sign and date, the subject must sign and date themselves. And the person taking consent not delegated to do so, so you would expect to see whoever is taking informed consent, that investigator is on the delegation log and has received appropriate protocol training. Examples of major deficiencies with regard to safety: failure to document all adverse events. We can often see there's a concomitant medication taken and listed in the CRF, but there's no corresponding adverse event. That's a simple example of not incompletely documented adverse events. We expect to see investigator review of adverse events. Decisions around adverse events are medical decisions, and we need to see medical input. Monitoring, none conducted now. That sounds critical, doesn't it? The only reason it was major is that at that particular site, at that particular time, we found no critical or major deficiencies. So the fact that it was done, no monitoring was done, we classified as major. That would normally be critical. We expect to see monitoring, clinical trial monitoring done. Insufficient monitoring conducted is another major. In those cases, you can see that things that we pick up were missed by the monitors, and they really should have been picked up a lot sooner than when we got there. And sometimes that is because they didn't have enough monitoring visits or enough time at site per monitoring visit. Major deficiencies in data handling include subject name used as identifier on documents sent from site. That can often happen on documents sent to support an SAE report, maybe a lab report or a scan report. And you can't, the subject identifier should not leave site. CRFs not reviewed or signed by an investigator. The decisions are medical decisions and they must be signed by an investigator. CRFs must be signed by an investigator to reflect that. Again, corrections made not reviewed by an investigator. Any medical changes to medical decisions must be reviewed by an investigator. Major deficiency if they're not. Document control. We've actually seen protocols updated by means of letter to the investigators, and this is extremely risky because the other site staff may not see that letter to the investigator because the protocol is a control document. It needs to be a control document. You need to be sure it's gone through the review procedures, including review by HPRA when it's necessary and by the ethics committee. Updating by letter, not on really. All essential documents not on file. Well, you know from the Section 8 of GCP there's an extensive list of essential documents, and there can be gaps in the trial file where all essential documents are not there. Resource issues, typically insufficient resources, no training of some personnel and trial related issues. lack of knowledge of GCP or local regulatory requirements. Now, the second one, no training of some personnel on trial-related issues. We often see that people who join the trial, for example, new investigators, when new recruits come in July, they must be trained in the protocol if they're to be involved in the trial. If they're to be sub-investigators in the trial, there needs to be evidence of that they're trained. They only have to receive targeted training that's necessary for their role, but they need to receive that training before they undertake any activities on the trial. And that's typically a kind of a gap that we see. Okay, just to briefly run you through possible actions arising from multiple major or critical deficiencies. Generally speaking, these are the actions that follow critical deficiencies. Sometimes if we find multiple minors, it'll be upgraded to one major deficiency because there are multiple minors in the same area. If we find multiple major deficiencies in the same area, it can be updated to a critical deficiency. Okay, so where we think we have that something is a critical deficiency, we take it back in-house for discussion with senior managers from the other departments as necessary, depending on the nature of the deficiency. We discuss it and agree an appropriate grading for the deficiency. Now, if it is a critical deficiency, some possible actions that may follow may be discussed at the Clinical Trials Subcommittee at the next monthly meeting, or the ACHM. It will be discussed certainly with the HPRA's board. It will certainly be discussed at that level at their Friday morning meetings, and they will decide whether it goes up to the subcommittee and the ACHM. Recommendations regarding corrective and preventive actions and follow-up inspections are discussed at these meetings, and very often a critical deficiency will result in a for-cause follow-up inspection in a reasonably short time frame. Sometimes we ask sponsors or investigators to come in-house to discuss the issue with us and to discuss their staffing and whatever other issues we feel that might have been a concern at that particular site or for that particular trial. That's relatively unusual, but sometimes those meetings can be very very useful, I beg your pardon. It can be very useful, but they're rare enough. I guess everybody is so busy these days, it's hard to organise those things, and there is so much correspondence and so many corrective and preventative action plans coming between the sponsor and site and us that a lot of the stuff can be dealt with that way. It's possible that clinical trial activities can be suspended at a site, or that sites can be asked to suspend recruitment. We've had to do that in the past, but that's as far as we've taken action thus far. Can I just make a few points about non-commercial trials? I think sometimes people don't realise that you can apply GCP perfectly, but without quite as complex an application as there may be in a big multinational sponsored clinical trial. Just a couple of points. When you're doing drug accountability, as a minimum, you need to include a procedure to identify which subjects received which IMP and an evaluation of their compliance. That's the minimum that you need. Sponsor companies often have much more elaborate accountability, which is good, that's fine, but just this is the minimum. Always remember that there's simplified labelling where an IMP is being used within its authorisation in the patient group for which it was intended. It's much easier to label IMP in those circumstances, and that is described in Article 14 of 2120 and also in Annex 13. An SMPC can be used instead of an investigator brochure where you're using an authorised product. Sometimes people aren't aware of that. Monitoring is particularly worthy of note. Since the mid-90s, you have been free to determine the appropriate extent and nature of monitoring. All sponsors have been free to determine that since the mid-90s. But sometimes we still see very elaborate monitoring plans that are not necessarily focusing on the main points. So we can see excessive monitoring, but they're not focusing on key safety parameters, they're not focusing on key efficacy parameters, they're not focusing on dose escalation points in the study. I would recommend that a great deal more thought is put into preparing appropriate monitoring plans. It is usual for monitoring to occur on site before, during, and towards the end of a trial, but in exceptional circumstances, remote monitoring can be justified. So you need to think about that. Statistically controlled sampling may be acceptable. Usually most monitoring plans define exactly how much data are to be checked, and not necessarily the most appropriate data at the most appropriate time for the conduct of that particular trial. So just bear in mind a little bit more thought when doing your monitoring plan would be a good idea. So we've done a few CRF inspections, and we've just found that some of the sponsor responsibilities were not fully addressed. As you know, the sponsor responsibilities are outlined in Section 5 of GCP, and they are onerous. When you are the sponsor, you are ultimately responsible for the trial, every aspect of the conduct of the trial. You are perfectly free to subcontract certain tasks and you need to give written agreements relating to that. But you are ultimately responsible, so you need to be kind of very conscious of what's required by Section 5 of GCP. We see problems with the quality management system at CRFs sometimes. Section 5 requires that you have SOPs describing all the procedures. Sometimes we find that they're uncontrolled, they're incomplete, or they're not being complied with, or there aren't enough SOPs to cover all of the activities. You need to just review that when you're setting up your CRF activities. Training is another kind of place we find deficiencies. Requirements not defined for each role. Initial training and refresher training needs not defined. Training records not maintained. Those areas are not actually all that difficult to address, but I think extra thought needs to be put in sometimes to those areas. We also noticed deficiencies in equipment maintenance and servicing, and inadequate temperature monitoring of investigational and medicinal product is sometimes evident also. So, in general, we find at our inspections that people are well aware of investigator responsibilities and investigator site responsibilities, but there's often less awareness of the sponsor responsibilities, and you just need to be aware of those when you take on a sponsor role. Okay, I hope I covered all those topics. I think I did. So thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you very much. That was a really informative presentation, and I know, having begun with an inspection, we now have everyone's attention for the day, which is excellent. We do have time for a question or two. Anybody? If not, I do have one question, and that is, obviously we've got many international clinical trials. How does the HPRA align choices about making inspections and outcomes of them with other agencies internationally, FDA, Japanese agencies, etc.?
There's a big improvement in that, in cooperation and information sharing in recent years. There were some instances where the FDA appeared at the site, and shortly after that European inspectors appeared at the site, and that's not a good use of resources. So there are agreements now to share information about where the different inspectorates are going to inspect. It doesn't cover the entire world yet, but they're working on it. So I think in future you should see repeat inspections at sites for a particular trial by more than one authority.
Very good. Thank you.